It seems like every time I start recording, my air conditioner kicks on, so that the first thing you get to hear is that humming noise. I should have like some music playing or something. Okay, before I go on in the lecture, I want to pretend like you're taking this survey in class. Normally what I would do in class is pass this out in paper, and you would make your marks on your piece of paper, and then we go over the answers in my lecture. So let's go ahead and just kind of go over this together. You can mark down your answers maybe on that same piece of paper you started earlier in the chapter. All right, so number one, in an introductory psychology class on campus, about 70% of the class is psychology majors, and the rest are math and science majors. One student in the class wears horn-rimmed glasses, carries a calculator, and takes notes with a mechanical pencil. What do you think this student's major most likely is? A, psychology, B, engineering, or C, botany? So go ahead and pick one of the majors, and then you can pause me if you need, and then we'll move on. Okay, so number two. How many academic departments are there at this college? Fewer than 15 or more than 15? Okay, pick one. 3, Mark and Jason are registering for next term. This is clearly an old example. You guys probably won't relate to it, but anyway. They leave their dorm room together, stop and eat breakfast together, chat with a mutual friend, and arrive at the registrar's office at the same time. They both line up to enroll in their art history classes. Oh, this is an old thing. You guys do it on the internet, but anyway. Mark is told the class he wanted was filled to capacity at the end of the previous day. Jason is told the class he wanted was filled to capacity 10 minutes before he arrived. Who is more upset, Mark or Jason? Can you guys imagine? We used to have to line up to register for our classes, and we literally would get that feedback. Oh, you just missed it. Okay, now don't do the math. Just estimate the answer to this problem. 8 times, 7 times, 6 times, 5 times, 4 times, 3 times, 2 times, 1. All right. Now I'm going to go back to my slide. Okay, so this is where I left off on the last lecture, and now it'll make more sense in the context of what you just did. All right, heuristics. So probably one of the most powerful heuristic techniques when dealing with other people is the representativeness heuristic. It actually applies to situations as well, but let's use it for other people. So here we are with situations. Which series of coin tosses is more likely? Heads, 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 tails, 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 or head, tail, tail, head. Which is more likely? Well, if you're like most people, you have selected the one on the right. It looks more likely, doesn't it? Because you know that coin flips are random, and it could be heads, it could be tails on on every flip, right? You have a 50-50 chance on every flip. But it turns out in a short string like this with only 6 flips, either one of those is equally likely. The equalness of the flips really pans out in the long run. So when you get to 100 flips, you'll expect half of them to have been heads and half of them to be tails. But you can get really long strings of either one in a row. So because the one on the right represents your schema for what is more likely in a random event, you tend to pick that. So let's look at question number 1 in the little survey that you just took, because it's an example of representativeness. I apologize for my cumbersome skills, but hey man, I'm a professor, I'm not a YouTuber. So in an introductory psychology class on campus, about 70% of the class is psychology majors and the rest are math and science. That is super important information right there. In an introductory psychology class on campus, about 70% of the class is psychology majors and the rest are math and science. Now we describe a student as wearing horn-rimmed glasses, carrying a calculator, and taking notes with a mechanical pencil. Those details objectively and statistically shouldn't matter in your decision to say that the most likely major is psychology. Because 70% of the students in that class are psych majors, any one individual is more likely to be a psych major than anything else. But he sure sounds like, he or she sure sounds like an engineering major, right? Wears horn-rimmed glasses, carries a calculator, takes notes with a mechanical pencil. That sounds like an engineering major. So what we do is we say, well, that person represents our schema for engineers and doesn't represent our schema for a psychology major or a botany major. So I'm going to run in the face of these statistics that 70% of these students are psych majors and say this person must be in the 30% that is a non-psych major. We would be more likely to be right if we said psychology, but it feels more right to say engineering. And that's the representativeness heuristic. We may make incorrect judgments because the person sounds like they represent our schema for that category. How about the availability heuristic? This heuristic says that if it's easy to think of, it must be common. Insurance sales people really take advantage of this. After there's been some kind of really well publicized accident of some sort or natural disaster of some sort, it's a great time to sell insurance because it's really available in people's minds that this bad thing could happen to them too. And so they want to get insurance against the possibility. If it's easy to think of, it's probably common. So which type of word is more rare? One that has N as the second to the last letter, or one that ends in ing? Well, a lot of people will pick the N as the second to the last letter because they have a hard time thinking about it. Words that end with N as the second to the last letter. But of course, that includes the field of all words that have in an ing, right? Because N is the second to the last letter if the ending is ing. But because it's easy to think of ing words, we think, okay, there's a lot of those. We try and think of words that have N in the second to the last position. We're like, what even is that? Like, that's super confusing. And so people will underestimate the one on the left and overestimate the one on the right, even as the one on the left is a subset of the one on the right. It's funny. Anchoring is when we use information that is sometimes even just completely incidental, but sometimes is relevant as the basis for our judgments about something. So let me give you one where it might be relevant. So let's say that you're the victim of a crime and you're being interviewed by the police, and they're asking you what the suspect looked like. And they say about how tall was the suspect, and you go, yeah, I don't even know. And so they follow up with, well, was the suspect taller or shorter than 6 feet? And then now you have an anchor. And so you go, well, less than 6 feet, right? You give an answer that's closer to 6 feet, that involves 6 feet, because they've given you an anchor, something to hang your guess on. Anchoring is really common in these kinds of ambiguous situations when you really don't know the answer. You'll grab onto sometimes even irrelevant things. I do a demonstration in my Psych 309 class where I have them write down the last 2 digits of their phone number. And then I show them a bunch of objects and ask them how much would they be willing to pay for them. People whose last 2 digits of their phone number tend to be willing to pay more for these objects than people who have lower last 2 digits of their phone number. Clearly those things are unrelated, but what has happened is that the number that they wrote down serves as a starting point for making guesses based on, 2-digit numbers of value. So we use those things as anchors. Now, let's go back to our little survey that you took at the beginning of this lecture. Number 2, how many academic departments are there at this college? What I do in my real class face-to-face is that half of the students get what you saw, which is fewer than 15 or more than 15. That served as an anchor for you, so you could say fewer or more. But the other half of the class see fewer than 30, more than 30, right? And with that anchor, what you find is that you have different estimates of how many departments there actually are because they were provided with an anchor, right? So you say, well, there's more than 15, and if I follow up with, well, how many do you think there are? You might say 18 or 20. If I ask you, are there more or fewer than 30? You might say, fewer than 30, 25, right? So you give something that's closer to 30 because that's the anchor that you were provided. I've done this demonstration with the length of the Mississippi River also, where you ask people, is the Mississippi River longer or shorter than 800 miles, or is it longer or shorter than 3,000 miles? And then how long is it? The people who were given the anchor of 800 miles tend to give answers somewhere around 1,000 miles. It's somewhere like 1,000 to 1,200 is the average in my classes. The ones who are given the anchor of 3,000 miles tend to give estimates that are closer to 3,000, and the average tends to be somewhere around 2,200. So you get like an extra 1,000 miles out of it based on whether you heard 800 or you heard 3,000 as your anchor. So that's what we mean by the anchoring heuristic. You use information, it might be relevant, it might not be relevant, to help you to start your guess in an ambiguous situation. Just FYI, our university has, as of the time that I made this slide, we had 60 departments. Simulation. So simulation is where in your mind you could imagine a different outcome. And if that different outcome is really salient, like you can really imagine that it could have happened that way, it will have a bigger impact on your feelings about the outcome that you got. So if we go back to number 3 on our survey, where we went down to the registrar to enroll in classes, Jason was told that his class was filled to capacity just 10 minutes before he arrived. He is going to be much more upset that had he not had breakfast before he tried to register, if he hadn't stopped to chat with that mutual friend before he came to register, he could have gotten into the class he wanted. That ability to simulate in his mind that it could have worked out that way. He could have had it if he'd just done like one thing different. Whereas Mark's like, it was hopeless. I was never going to get in that class. It was full before I even thought of coming down, or I was eligible to register. And so he's not going to be as upset because there was nothing he could have done about it. Jason, there's a couple of things he could have done about it, so he's going to be a lot more upset. So if you can really visualize, simulate in your mind a different outcome, it's going to be a lot more dismaying that you got the outcome that you got, right? Adjustment. Adjustment is a heuristic where I thought I had a definition for you. Adjustment is where you can, I'm trying to define it without using the word adjust. So my brain is struggling. Sorry, searching my lexicon for a word that means basically the same thing, but it's a different word. So you change, you alter your expectations or your, the schema that you're using based on the current circumstances. So one heuristic is that you will potentially need to adjust given new information, that you're going to have to be a little bit more flexible than maybe you naturally want to be. Another aspect of selecting a schema relates to the natural contours of the information. I talked a little bit earlier about going to a restaurant, and I told you that's actually called a script. So here's the word script for you. It's a type of schema that basically tells you what should happen in a particular context. So going to a restaurant's an example, or experiencing a psychology lecture, right? Like you have certain things that you think should happen in a class lecture. There are certain things that you wouldn't expect to have happen, like if I were to start juggling in class or something, something like that. That would violate your script for what normally happens in a psychology lecture. I can tell you it would violate your script if you've ever had me for class, because for sure I can't juggle. So I've tried, but I don't have it. The peripheral vision thing, I just know. So if I were to start doing that, that would violate my script for a psychology lecture too. I can tell you that. I can tell you times, I have given a million lectures probably in my career, and I can tell you the ones that have been the most memorable are the ones that have violated the scripts. Like when an earthquake struck in the middle of, I was talking about Freudian defense mechanisms, and a 7.1 earthquake struck. I was living in the Puget Sound region at the time, and the power went out, and the students dove under their little tiny desks, and that script violation made it very memorable, right? And so that was a natural contour of the information, right? And so I distinctly remember all the things that were going on in that lecture. How many other lectures in my life have I given, and I've forgotten the details of them, right? But that one, I even remember what exactly I thought, and I'm lecturing on defense mechanisms, and the earth shook. It's like a little, what would you call it, where a person, is giving their opinion on whether you should be talking about this anymore? I was being censored. Natural contours of information also include certain breakpoints, right? There are certain points in a conversation where you can kind of change schemas and start talking about something else. Maybe you move from one location to another. That's a natural breakpoint where you could start to implement a different script. Those kinds of things, right? Where there are these natural breakpoints that make it make sense to change the schema that you're using. Script violations, like I mentioned, having an earthquake hit in the middle of your normal everyday psychology lecture. That's a good example of, switching schemas. It was really it was a jarring experience. See, you gotta love your unconscious, because it picked that word for me, and then as I was uttering it, I'm like, that was a little on the nose while I'm talking about an earthquake. But it was a little striking or shocking to me that I went from teaching about psychology to now I'm the person who's supposed to know what we're supposed to do in event of an earthquake. Like, wait a minute, I am not the safety officer. I don't know what's going on either. So I told everybody, stay under your desks in case there's an aftershock and let me check. And I look out and people were gathering in the quad. So I'm like, okay, let's just go outside. And we all like stood there not knowing what to do next, all afraid to get near the buildings. And but that was actually pretty an abrupt schema change, where I had to go from person who's standing here talking about stuff to person who's actually responsible for these people's safety. Like, that was I was not prepared for that. But I shifted schemas. I went into sort of Girl Scout leader mode. And I'm like, okay, I'm used to being in charge of other people's safety. Okay, I'll just do that. So I shifted scripts, basically. Another factor that contributes to selecting a schema is salience. How easy it is to pick out from the environment, what is important and what schema would probably apply, given this person or this situation. Primacy. Primacy refers to whatever sort of attracts your attention first, right? The primacy effect refers to whatever came to your awareness first. And so that is what's going to contribute to your schema selection. I'm already thinking about this, right? Like, I walked into this room, this is what caught my attention, this is the schema I'm going with, until maybe there's a natural break point or something else more salient takes my attention away. So primacy relates to this little demo here. So when you look at this math problem and you're supposed to just estimate the answer to the problem, the numbers are small. So I told you not to do the math. I told you just to estimate. And so you probably thought, well, the numbers are small. It's probably a small number. So when I show you what the answer is, you might be a little bit blown away to see that it's actually a very large number that is the answer to the question. 40,320 when you actually do the math. When we approach a problem, the first thing, it's a small number, will help to set up the schema that we're using. Now, those of you who have taken certain kinds of math might be familiar with factorial numbers, and so you might have seen that's really just 8 factorial, and you might have already known that was going to be a huge number. So for you, that's the primacy. You recognized that it was a factorial number, and so you approached it from that angle. For all the rest of us, we're like 8 times 7, well, that's only 56, and then we think blah, blah, and we go, I don't know, 300, right? Like, we just make an estimate. Priming is very closely related to primacy. Priming is an issue where you've been exposed to something that's related to what's going on in the conscious world, and that gets you already set up in a particular schema, that you were primed to be placed into that schema. So one of the things you might have noticed on these slides, or you might not have noticed, I tried to make them kind of obtrusive, is that I put art pieces in the upper right hand corner, even to the point where they were obscuring some of the words that I put on the slide. I was trying to sort of subconsciously or unintentionally on your side, like, prime you to be thinking about artists. The names of the artists happen to be these, and in the order that they appeared. So this last one should be Dolly. As a person who never took art history, I'm just trusting that I got the right names for everybody. But the idea that I was trying to put in your head was to get you thinking about art, get you thinking about maybe some of the artists that you might have recognized. Like, I recognized Pollock. Actually, I don't think these are in the order that they were presented, because I think Pollock was just a couple of slides ago. So these aren't in order. This isn't Dolly. This has to be Monet, I think. Well, I don't know. I never took art history, so those of you who have are sitting there going, "Oh my gosh, you don't even know who made that." It's either Monet or the one who lived by that pond and painted it for like 30 years, but I can't remember his name. But the idea is by putting something into the background like that, it can get you into a schema where you're more open to information pertaining to that topic. That's the basic idea. And so now you're thinking along that line without even necessarily knowing that you were thinking along that line. That's the issue about having like posters in classrooms or other kinds of things. Those can serve as primes for you to be thinking about something that might not be related to the class or might not be helpful to your understanding of the material in the class. And so it's like a really big topic, especially in universities and colleges, where different subjects are taught in that same classroom. It's different when you're like K through 12 teacher and your subject is going to be taught in this classroom the whole time. To have different kinds of content in a class. I teach Psych 309 sometimes in the same classroom that education classes are taught, and so they have all this information about teaching middle schoolers and all this stuff up on the walls that is completely not relevant to Psych 309, and so it's a little concerning to me that this is priming my students to be thinking about maybe their middle school years, or and that it might be feeding their sense of this is content that I can't really understand in a way that middle school might have felt like to them, and other things that I don't want to have happen, but I'm not in charge of what's on those walls. So just things to think about. So the thing about selecting a schema is that once we have picked one and we've said, okay, I can see where this is going, I know what kind of person this is, I know what the situation is about, we can actually produce self-fulfilling prophecies, because in two ways. One is that no matter what really ends up happening, we may interpret it through the filter of our schema as fulfilling our schema. Right? And so we're like, see, I was right. They behaved the way I predicted, or the situation went the way I expected it to. Even if there were nuanced errors in our assumption, right? On the other hand, there's the possibility that because we came in with our schema in place, we're acting in a certain way that is eliciting responses from the environment that are consistent with our expectations. And that wasn't how the environment was really going to be, except for that we came in and started acting like that. So next time you walk into a room and you're like, oh, we might get in an argument, I'm going to be really nice so we don't get into an argument, and then somehow you find yourself in an argument, you might want to think about the fact that maybe it was stuff you were putting out. I know sometimes I come into a room and start an argument that I didn't want to get into. Oh no, this isn't me. But guess what? I probably was putting off, I'm irritated vibes and elicited it from the environment, and they weren't going to be that way, but it was at least half my fault that we're in this argument, right? All right, so that concludes our Chapter 3 content. I will see you next in Chapter 4.